Welcome to Khanversations. I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan, and today I'm going to talk about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Russia. This is his uh, first visit since 2019, even though he has met President Putin a number of times, once in Central Asia. But this is his first visit, and it is quite critical because this is his first bilateral visit after winning elections for a third time in India. He did have an international trip to the G7 summit in Italy, but this is his first bilateral visit, and the Russians are making a big deal out of it, saying that the West is jealous that Modi chose to go to Russia and meet Putin as his first bilateral visit in his new term as Prime Minister of India. This is very critical. I mean, besides the details of the trip, this is rather significant from a strategic point of view. And so I'm going to share with you five takeaways as to why I think this Modi's visit to Russia is quite consequential. But before that, do subscribe to Khanversations if you have not already done so. Like this video, press the bell icon so that you get notifications of new videos. And don't forget to share this with your social political network. I'm not in my usual studio today. I'm at the University of Delaware. I'm in one of the classrooms. So if there are some audio visual deficiencies, please forgive me. So the first point that I want to make is the timing of this visit. It is 2 days prior to the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. NATO is celebrating its 75th anniversary, and all the members of NATO are coming to Washington, D.C., where the treaty was signed 75 years ago. So the visuals, the optics are startling. Prime Minister Modi has chosen to stand with Putin is Moscow, while all the Western leaders are aligned and together in Washington, D.C. The message that he's trying to say is that India's grand strategy of strategic autonomy is still valid, still alive, and he has the freedom to go to Moscow and stand with Putin, and that he has not fully been subsumed into the Western strategic ecosphere. So that is, I think, the most important visual that I see, and this is, I think, the key takeaway from this meeting, that at the time when NATO is having its 75th celebration. Remember, it kind of like Amrit Mahotsav of NATO. Modi chooses to go to Russia. It's a very strong message trying to send, especially to the United States, that yes, you are an important ally, but we have not abandoned Russia entirely, even though the West has tried its best to isolate Putin and make a pariah out of him. It's not just him. Putin is having actually a very good time. And in a separate conversation, I will talk about all the leaders who have met with Putin just in the past 2 weeks. So that is one critical message. But from a strategic point of view, like I have been saying, that in this term, it is quite inevitable that the gap between Russia and India are going to increase, and India is going to come closer and closer to the West and is going to become part of the Western ambit from a strategic point of view. But the fact remains that Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea are here, and India is not here for the NATO summit. So that's the first takeaway, that India continues to remain basically on both sides. It is with the West primarily when it attends the G7 summit, and then it is also with those who are not part of the West when he stands and hugs Putin in his suburban residence in Moscow. The second takeaway is that India has not really abandoned Russia. This is just a bilateral thing. While there are historical reasons, there are also key strategic interests. One of the key interests that India has is to keep its options open. It does not fully want to become dependent on West as a source of weapons, even though India has steadily diversified. In fact, in the last 5-6 years, since the S-400 deal, there has been no major purchase of weapons from Russia. And so India is very rapidly delinking its defense systems from the Russian defense system. It's only maintenance, continuity, and service of old purchases that has kept India connected to Russia. And India's dependence on Russian defense ecosystem has declined significantly, and India has now become very much part of the Western system. It is buying from the United States, it's buying from France, it's buying from Israel and Italy, and also Germany. So these are the countries who are now supplying India's advanced weaponry. So even though India is clearly moving away from the Russian defense system, it does not want to move away from Russia as a partner. And you can see that in trade, and India has taken advantage of the discounted Russian oil, and India's bilateral trade has now reached over $65 billion. But one strategic reason that India does have in maintaining a close partnership with Russia is the growing dependence of Russia on China. So if the more Russia depends on China to survive this war, to thrive economically, right now the Russia-China trade has simply catapulted to over 200 and close to $250 billion. China is the biggest buyer of Russian oil, and China is now the biggest exporter of critical technologies and things that keep the Russian military going. The West is quite upset that they think that Russia is able to fight for so long and may continue to do so because of the military industrial support that China is providing. India is worried that the close partnership of Russia and China may end up in the long run making Russia, who is a friend and an historical ally, into an adversary. So the reason why Modi is there is to ensure that Russia continues to remain a friend of India, and the closer it gets to China, it does not become an adversary of India, like Pakistan, for example. The third takeaway is essentially a bilateral, and that has got to do with trade and one minor issue of Indians who are in the Russian army. And it seems that Prime Minister Modi has achieved a major diplomatic victory. Putin has assured Modi that he will find all the Indians who have been conscripted into the Russian army, and then he will send them back home. Some of them might even be coming back with Prime Minister Modi himself. So this is a diplomatic victory. It was a low-hanging fruit, and Prime Minister Modi plucked it right away. From the bilateral relations, the key is the trade deficit. So if you were to look at 2019 or 20, India-Russia trade was around $8 billion. Now it is over $65 billion. But India's exports have not significantly risen. India exports less than $4 billion worth of goods to Russia and is importing more than $61–62 billion worth of stuff, most of it crude oil. And because they are trying to avoid American sanctions, their trade is either in rubles and rupees or in yuan and dirham. So when India uses yuan, it essentially advances China and China's importance as an alternate currency to de-dollarization, which India does not want to do. But if India is going to pay Russia $60 billion for its oil in rupees, so what is Russia going to do with those rupees? Because India does not sell much. So the idea is to somehow convince the Russians to buy either agricultural products or pharmaceutical products from India and try to reduce the trade imbalance, which has gone over $60 billion. So now the second biggest trade imbalance that India has after China, which is around $90 billion, is with Russia, which is over $60 billion. So from a bilateral perspective, the key element for this meeting between Modi and Putin is bilateral trade. And we will see what happens, what other manufacturings. One idea is that Russia will use that rupees that it has in Indian banks to invest in a certain kinds of manufacturing, which will then be exported to Russia. So essentially, Russian market-oriented manufacturing and the investments coming from Russia. It's a very interesting idea. Let us see if it is if they are able to realize that. And my fourth take is from the Russian point of view. So, what does this trip mean to Russia? For Russia, this shows that Western efforts to isolate Russia have failed. That Putin is not a pariah and Putin is very popular. India is the fifth biggest economy, soon to become the third biggest economy, the biggest democracy in the world, a rising mm, middle power. It is the growth of India which makes the claim that the world is a multipolar world more credible. And so Putin being hugged by Modi and standing there essentially tells you that he is very much part of the world, very much an important player in the world. So it's a legitimizing exercise for Putin, and so that is very critical for Putin. So they're milking this for what it's worth. But there is also the dependence that India is now the second biggest market for Russian oil. In fact, I think 45% of all Indian energy needs are now being supplied. So, just as Europe cut itself off from Russia, India has essentially replacing Germany and other European countries as the market. Unfortunately, the north-south corridor has not fully developed. Otherwise, there can be more trade with Russia and India. Hopefully, that will materialize soon. But for the Russians, the key element is that they have an important country which is willing to risk potential secondary sanctions from the United States, or is the only country in the world that the US is reluctant to impose sanctions on and is also willing to trade with Russia. So that is why India is very important for Russia at the moment. It is its second biggest market. And from a legitimacy point of view, it is the number one source of international legitimacy for Russia. So, this meeting, this visit, the resumption of bilateral meetings are critical for Putin. And finally, I think India is a rising power, and to have India in its corner is critical for Russia because even Russia does not want to become too dependent on China. So if Russia feels that if it becomes too dependent on China for its exports and its imports, it could end up becoming a vassal state of China. And having India as a balancing pole will allow Russia and Putin the freedom to not completely compromise its own strategic autonomy and continue to make the case that, look, we have other places where we can sell our oil and other sources from whom. The key difference is that India is unwilling to export or perhaps cannot export things that can be used in the war in Ukraine. Modi also called for Russia to initiate peace process and to work towards peace. So it's India's support for Russian war efforts are not comparable to China's. So that is one of the strategic weaknesses. But having India in its camp ensures that Russia does not fully become dependent on China alone and does not become China's vassal state. So, from that perspective, you could argue that India's friendship with Russia is a long term asset for Russia, even if India stops buying weapons from Russia. Zelensky, of course, was very upset. He sent a statement on being very critical of Modi's visit. He feels as if the world is supposed to be loyal to him, and he sees this as essentially a betrayal by India. And the United States has called on India to essentially use its good relations with Putin and with Russia to essentially respect the sovereignty of Ukraine. But clearly, people in the Western capitals are very, very upset with this visit. And given the uncertainty and unstable international environment, what really happens in unstable international environments is the rules that govern the international system become weak, and therefore it becomes very difficult to predict the actions and the policies of states. And the unpredictability also puts a lot of stress on national resources. So I think what India is doing is in its national interest, and I'm glad that it's able to do this. And it is not compromising its national interest under pressure from the West these days. the West seems to be obsessed with the war in Ukraine, and they see the war in Ukraine as some kind of an existential issue with regards to the current liberal order and the West as a geopolitical concept. And they are demanding that the rest of the world uh, undermine and subvert their own national interests to advance the interests of the West as a geopolitical entity. And the fact that Modi is refusing to do that is kudos to him and to India and India's strategic thinking. India is not just in the Western camp. India is one of the leaders of the rest of the world and is also strategically aligned and valued by both the West and the rest. So this whole visit of Prime Minister Modi to Moscow is very critical, and it continues to tell us that the Western hegemony is not as strong as it was 5 years ago. So these are my 5 takeaways about Modi's visit to Moscow. I hope you found them interesting and thought-provoking. If so, and if not, also subscribe to Khanversations, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share this video with your friends and your socio-political network. Until next time, I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan. Take care.